go ahead.
Okay. All right, welcome everybody to the second of 3 webinars, which is part of the Writing to Achieve Policy Impact session run by the On Think Tank School. For those of you who didn't make it last time, my name's Kern. I'm a strategic communications consultant who's been training on this course for the last couple of years. I also do a bit of writing for the On Think Tanks network, and yeah, so I've been involved with them for about two or 3 years. I'd like to keep this session to an hour today because I'm conscious that people are joining us from later time zones. So if you do have a question, pop it in the chat box and I'll address it at points in time during the webinar. But do feel free, as I said earlier, to unmute your microphone when we have any of the discussion sessions. So this session is on policy briefs. They're a product that are very dear to my heart. I've written many of them or helped researchers develop theirs. I've also had a hand in editing sort of dozens and dozens of different types of policy briefs from think tanks across the globe. So I'm going to switch over to my slides now. And Sophia, if you could kill my screen so that I don't distract anybody as I'm flipping through.
Okay.
Wonderful. When we go back to the discussion, might remind you to put it back on so that we can have a bit more of a live discussion. Right, so this is our session for today. We're going to talk very briefly about what policy briefs are, why they're important. I don't feel as though I need to spend a long time convincing a set of people who have chosen to come and train on this topic about why they're important, but just want to put it into context before we kick off. I'm then going to talk to you about the 2 different types of policy briefs, but with the caveat that I will be talking only about the objective policy brief in this session, because that's the kind of policy brief that think tanks and research-led institutions tend to produce, although I want you to be aware of the advocacy brief. And I'll show you what those look like. I'll also post a link at the end to those 2 particular briefs because I think they're good examples of each, which is why I've chosen them. We'll have a quick discussion to gauge what kind of policy briefs your organizations produce, although I've had a little look at some of the organizations that you're drawn from, and it does seem like the objective policy brief is primarily what the participants of this course's organizations produce. Who reads them, who writes them, and then the second to last agenda item is actually the biggest chunk. So these are by no means equally distributed in terms of time. So our second to last agenda item is basically how to develop a policy brief, what the key components should be, and I also include some design techniques that a lot of different organizations use to sort of amplify their key messages. So that's our agenda for today. Before I kick off, any questions on that agenda? Brilliant. Okay, doesn't look like much is coming in. So what are policy briefs and why are they so important? Let's begin with a definition. A policy brief I would define as a standalone and concise document that focuses on one policy issue that requires attention. What I mean by concise is that it's ideally 4 pages, usually 2 pages minimum to get your point across, 8 pages maximum. A lot of people have a lot of trouble with this because they struggle to condense their very long report into anything smaller than 8 pages, especially if it's 100 odd pages. But I would contend that if you want a policy maker to read it, to read big chunks of it, I wouldn't go beyond 8 pages. It becomes like a report, even if you stamp the word policy brief on it. One thing I would say is that we're using a very particular definition of policy brief here, although there are 2 that I'll go through. But if you search online, if you search policy brief online, you will see very, very different things that call themselves policy briefs. Sometimes you'll see organizations publishing 30-page policy briefs under that title. I think that's fine. Obviously they've decided to call that. They felt that it fits with that sort of description, but for me it really is a very concise 4 to 8 page piece that is focusing on one issue requiring attention, not multiple issues. Sorry. In terms of what it does, policy brief, you'll see there, it explains the urgency of an issue, clearly state the problem there. Sorry, we're getting a bit of feedback. Has somebody got their microphone on? Anyone? Okay, it stopped, great. It's understandable without additional reading or specialized knowledge. So going back to our last session, it's stripped of jargon. You don't need to read the full report that the policy brief perhaps is drawn from in order to understand what it's getting at, what its main ideas are. It presents policy recommendations or implications, which are sort of softer versions of recommendations on the issue, and provides entry points where appropriate. And I'll go through what entry points are with regards to recommendations a little bit later in the piece. And finally, it points readers to additional resources. So maybe to your full report, or maybe you've produced various bite-sized products that draw from that report. So perhaps a website companion with additional resources, or a podcast, or a blog. So that's what a policy brief sort of does. Again, won't spend a lot of time on why policy briefs are important, but just to say that a lot of people work in organizations that do quite dense research, but I would argue that sort of public policy research is really, you're really trying to change the world here. You're essentially you're wanting to improve public policy outcomes through what you do, or to bring to light issues so that other people can work on tackling those. So it really isn't enough anymore to publish a very dense and long report without without basically pulling out its implications and making it readable and accessible to those who are working in policy. I've worked for various UN agencies, as I said last week, and for donors and for partner governments, as well as for think tanks. So I've done the writing and dissemination of policy briefs, but I've also worked inside organizations that use them. And I can tell you that, obviously some things are driven by politics, by what a particular ministry or civil servant is driving, but day to day, civil servants aren't pulling things out of thin air. They need research to inform the policy directions they're proposing. And so your policy briefs, what you produce, is getting quoted in diplomatic cables back up to headquarters. It's getting pulled out to produce speaking points for the, an envoy coming to town. This stuff does get used if you package it well and you disseminate it well. So it's really important to see how important policy briefs are. That said, I don't want to sell policy briefs as the kind of be-all and end-all of research, of the way that you would have research impact. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, but this is just to highlight that there is what's called a research policy divide when it comes to evidence and getting evidence into the policy sphere and getting it implemented. Researchers and policy makers are quite different beasts. For example, they have quite divergent needs. Researchers are often focused on sort of rigorous studies and often wrap their conclusions in caveats because that's what they've been taught to do. They talk about what they found, but they kind of say, but more research is needed oftentimes. And their incentives are mainly to produce, academic articles which aren't necessarily read outside of academia. Now, that's not to say that research isn't changing and that donors are driving research-led organizations to sort of not just publish in academic articles, but to make things more accessible. But they are quite different sets of people. Policymakers, they're constrained by the speed at which they have to make decisions. They're usually generalists rather than specialists. There's a certain level of spin that they might have to attach to the decisions that they're making. So it's just to kind of highlight here that researchers and policymakers are quite different. So yes, policy briefs are important. Research institutes and think tanks should write them and invest time in them because they have been shown to be able to feed into the policy process, but it's not the only thing. These are sort of the four areas where policymakers and researchers are a bit different. Again, this is drawn from an ODI briefing paper that I've posted as part of the of your resources within the Moodle, which again talks about all the different things that impact on a policymaker's decision on certain things. So it's not, evidence sits there in the middle, and we've put it nice and prominently. But actually, there's all sorts of other things that will have an impact on what and on the direction of policy. What policy briefs can do is, given this divide between policymakers and researchers, they can act as a bridge for translating research for your audience, making evidence sort of more understandable outside of the formal academic environment. And I know a lot of you don't work for universities or for pure academic organizations. So this might not completely apply to you. You might feel, no, actually we're producing a lot of policy relevant and policy driven stuff. It's not just stuff in journals, but for some organizations, this is still the reality. So basically, these briefs make your evidence more accessible and more usable. Any questions? Okay. There is some quite good reading around this sort of issue. If any of you are interested, do post on the Moodle, and I'm happy to point you to different stuff with regards to that. So what are the different types of policy briefs? I've read a lot of different briefs and worked with a lot of different organizations, I guess, and our time at ODI, or my time at ODI, has kind of revealed that there's two main types of things that call themselves policy briefs. One is an objective or synthesis tool, and the other is a more openly sort of advocacy type tool. And they're developed in two quite different ways. So the objective policy brief, which is what you see on the left here, and it's what sort of ODI, the Overseas Development Institute would produce. It's basically a policy brief that presents some problems and suggests to policymakers how they might respond. So in this case, it was quite one of our most popular policy briefs for some years. This was a brief by Stephen Wiggins on rising food prices, written back in 2008. Basically alerted people to the problem, synthesized what was actually going on, what the dynamics were, and then made some suggestions for what different actors should do. The advocacy brief, which is what you can see here on the right-hand side, with this example from, it was produced by the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. This is urging Uganda's government to adopt a particular approach to farmers' education. So it's much more, it's outright advocacy. It's not, it might be written in an objective way, but it's much more bolshy, I guess. It's let me move across to this slide. So these are the sort of different types, and I'm not going to go through bit by bit what they do, because as I said, I'm going to concentrate largely on a policy brief as a synthesis tool, with still provides recommendations rather than an advocacy tool. But here are the differences. Oftentimes you will see that the objective of these are quite different. So a synthesis advocacy brief will summarize evidence or summarize what's happening, whereas an advocacy tool will often do a bit of that, but then jump right into to kind of state its point and try and prove it. Similarly, the synthesis tool will often provide an overview of multiple options available on that topic, whereas an advocacy tool will only talk about that. Now, that's not to say, ODI and other organizations like Chatham House and other think tanks that I've worked with do sometimes, come out on one side of a fence, on one side of the fence, and are a bit more. They bleed into the advocacy category a bit more, but oftentimes it's written more objectively. There will be at least some mention or allusion to other points of view that could be considered. And apologies there's a word missing in this quadrant here, and I'll add that to the updated PowerPoint. So let's have a quick discussion, because I'm making the assumption that a lot of you are producing more objective types of policy briefs, but it would be good to know from you whether that's wrong, or whether that's changing, or whether your donors are asking you to do different things with regards how you write your policy briefs, how they're presented, and quite how forthright they can be. So is anybody willing to sort of either chat in the chat box, tell me what type of policy brief their organisation tends to produce? Or indeed unmute yourself and speak to the group. That would be even better. Anyone?
Okay, I'll tell a little bit. We have started a series of policy briefs of good e-governance, like online forms of governance in Ukraine. And it was like, a fresh start for this, because we don't have that much policy-related analytics in our country. The whole field is brand new. So we try to provide kind of an overview of practices, what's there in the world, and what is happening in Ukraine. And we'll provide some recommendations. So let's say of 5 pages, half of the last page was devoted to these kind of advocacy efforts. And the rest was kind of a civic education process. So that's how we did in Ukraine in this particular field.
And so would you say that it falls more into the objective type of policy brief that I've described? Because you talked there about how you're sort of providing an overview of the landscape. So
Right.
you've still got recommendations, but you're kind of trying to be quite objective, it sounds, with that.
True. So 80% of it were objective, and the last, let's say, not even 20, but say 10% were kind of promoting some change, like recommending.
Okay. No, and that's fine. And that's I hope the objective policy brief can have recommendations. And one of the things that we're going to spend some time on here as I go through this presentation is actually, what those objective recommendations look like. You're still telling policymakers to do something, otherwise it wouldn't really be a policy brief. But I wanted to set it apart from more kind of advocacy briefs that really don't present any other point of view. It's kind of, this is what you need to do. So yeah, thanks very much for giving us a taste of what you're doing in your organization in Ukraine. Anybody else? Okay, that's fine. If you would like to just, if a comment comes to you and you want to put it in the chat box, please do go ahead. And I can pick that up a bit later in the discussion. So, who reads policy briefs? I mean, not to be facetious, but really it's whoever you're disseminating it to. But ideally, these sorts of groups should be on your list. So you'd be targeting decision makers. They'd either be, political people like ministers, or more broadly civil servants, possibly ministerial advisors or other types of advisors. You may be also wanting to sort of sensitize the official opposition to what you're doing, in the hopes that when they come into government, they'll kind of have some idea of the kind of evidence that you're producing on that particular topic. Practitioners often use policy briefs quite a lot. So, NGOs, UN agencies, community-based organizations, local groups use policy briefs and refer to them. Civil society organizations. Other think tanks are using policy briefs a lot, because they're basically something that synthesizes what their peers are doing. So they're often used quite a bit there, as well as advocacy groups and media organisations. Just a note there that, I mean, by virtue of what they're called, policy briefs, really the audience for them includes a lot of non-academic and non-specialists. So you really, I want to drive home the point that they really do need to be as accessible as possible. You need to strip out all the jargon and make your argument as simple as possible. Also, just again, some people that are sitting here listening to this webinar may not necessarily be communications people, or indeed have a very big communications department within their organisation. But just to stress the importance of putting together a good mailing list or event invite to get your policy brief disseminated and into the right hands. Oftentimes that isn't, that is about perhaps having a database that you're building up little by little over the course of many months and years, that is your institution's database. But it can also be, more actively as a researcher, making sure that all those contacts that you've drawn together over the course of your research, all the people that you met with, they filter into that database, or the very, or even better, that you write them a targeted email letting them know that policy brief is now available. It sounds, again, some of the points that I make do sound a bit silly, like of course we'll send it to all our contacts, but it does surprise me how many organizations don't quite know where their policy briefs are going to, and who are scrambling around at the end of a process when the policy brief has either been printed or it's all been nicely laid out, to come up with the list of people that they're sending it to. So just a sort of plug, I guess, from the communications side, that it's really important to have those lists in place, or to work, and if you don't have them in place, to work on some ways of pulling them together. As I said earlier when I was introducing the different types of policy briefs, the advocacy or objective, there's different organizations that write policy briefs. Here's a kind of smattering of organizations that I've put up, but these, and they're quite diverse. So excuse me, the European Commission is on there twice. You've got everything from quite large, like donor type organizations, like the European Commission, to advocacy groups like Greenpeace, NGOs like Save the Children, UN agencies are producing policy briefs. So it's not just think tanks that are producing them. So the space is not yours in terms of policy briefs. It really, there's a lot of people putting out a lot of products that are calling themselves that these days. So just be aware of that. I believe we've got a couple of people joining us. Welcome to the session. We've just kicked off. We've done a few definitions on policy briefs. I'll let you look back at those slides a bit later, but welcome to those who have just come online. Okay, so this is the biggest chunk of our session today. That is the policy brief content and how to develop it. I didn't, we're going to spend the next half an hour really talking about how you do that, what the different sections look like, with some examples of those. And again, if you, as we did last time, if you are keen for additional resources, or I mentioned something and you want a bit more information on that, then please do put that in the chat box or bring it up in the discussion afterwards. So here's how I would advocate that you develop your policy brief. There's sort of 4 steps. And it goes back slightly to what I was talking about last week with regards how you sort of start the writing process. So the first thing you need to do is identify the purpose and overarching message of the policy brief. If you remember to my initial definition, your policy brief is really making one particular point. You might have various recommendations under that point, but you're really concentrating on one thing that needs policy attention. So identify your purpose, identify what the problem is, and write it down and have it on your desk somewhere, so that while you're going through the writing process, you keep reminding yourself, and that will help you write paragraphs that are always sort of contributing to that and strengthening your overall point and purpose. So just by way of an example, I work a lot on health-related issues. So for a health policy brief, you might be describing a gap between health status and health objectives. That might be the main purpose of the policy brief. You might be addressing a lack of consensus around a solution to a problem that's already out there. So that there's lots of policy briefs that really are kind of mapping out what all the different points of view are, and the fact that there's a lack of consensus over a problem that has been clearly identified. You might even be calling attention to a new problem or to new knowledge that has come up around a particular area and how it should be used and channeled. So there's lots of that's what I mean about your purpose of your policy brief. Like, define what you're doing. Am I pushing a certain, am I identifying a gap? Am I mapping out all the different competing solutions to a clearly defined problem? Am I saying that a new research agenda is needed around a particular topic? What am I doing? So identify that, write it down, have it at the very top of your page. And sorry, there's the slide on what your overarching theme might be. The second thing that you do, or that I do when developing a policy brief, is right at the beginning, figure out what your key policy recommendations or implications are. If you are synthesizing a longer report, this is usually a little bit easier because you've usually got those policy recommendations or implications buried sometimes within that longer, more dense report. But equally, if you're not synthesizing something and you're maybe wanting to do a policy brief on midway through your research to bring to light a new way of thinking about a particular issue, do still think about what you're asking the reader to do. So you've got your purpose, and then what are you asking the decision maker to do with that overall message? What stems from that? And for me, this is the sort of why should I read this question that I think that you really have to keep in mind, especially with when you're targeting decision makers, but everybody really. is flooded every day with a massive information that they have to prioritize in terms of what they read, whether they even read it at all. So it's really important that even though you might be have a project that's very close to your heart, and you don't understand why people don't get as excited as you, to really sort of step back and kind of think, okay, why are they going to read this? Why are they going to read beyond the first or second paragraph? I'd say that in terms of recommendations and implications, they're really one of the most important components of a policy brief, and something that you shouldn't tack on to the end. It really should be front and center. It should come in immediately after you've identified what your overall purpose is. As mentioned before, public policy research is really about affecting some sort of change. So you want to have front and center what your recommendations are, and not to just develop them as a tack on to your piece. So do think about that as sort of almost like the biggest priority when you're developing them. I mean, one thing to say, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, is that some researchers are hesitant to just come out and put out quite bolshy recommendations. They put qualifiers around it, and they put caveats around the findings of their paper. Policy briefs aren't a place for that sort of thing. If you want your research to have some impact, then it's really important to be quite specific about the changes that you want to make, even if that is that there should be more research on a topic, but be explicit. The more sort of advocacy type briefs, but also some objective briefs, will talk about the specific laws, regulations, funding priorities, or practices that they're seeking to change through this research. And that's usually where the sort of policy brief that gets sort of more bang for its buck, where you're being very clear about what you're trying to change, what you're telling the decision maker you want to happen. We'll go through how to develop policy recommendations in a moment, but I just really wanted to stress how important they are, because I often see policy briefs being written and then people thinking about their recommendations or implications list right at the very end, and it sort of screws up the flow of your policy brief, because sometimes you haven't really thought about some of the implications that or you haven't addressed within your policy brief some of the things that you're recommending. So you really should think about that front and center, and the rest of your policy brief should flow from those. Sorry. Oh, it's not moving on. Sorry. Right, so number 3 is that stemming from the overarching purpose, and as well as the policy recommendations that you've decided that you want to push, you need to construct a logical line of argument for making these recommendations. Now we've gone through this, in some depth last time, and for those who have just joined the course and who are late starters, do have a look at that session, because it's much more in depth than this slide summarizes. But this is identifies some of the logical patterns that you might use in developing writing, particularly things that are sort of pushing a point or making an argument. And for those of you who joined last week, you'll be quite familiar with those. For those that are just joining, I'll very briefly just summarize that the term line of argument refers to sort of your logical thread. and that's what leads the reader through a paper and ensures that the paper has some coherence to it. You need to have a logical line of argument in things like policy briefs, because you're not just telling a story, you're not writing fiction, you're leading them on a journey to come to a certain conclusion. So it's really important that you choose a few of these logical patterns, and that your logical line of argument is clear, that it links to what your overarching purpose is, to what the recommendations you make at the end of your paper, and that it's peppered with logical connectors that sort of guide your reader through that piece. And there's some logical connectors there, but this is by no means a definitive list. So for those just joining, do have a look at the webinar, the first webinar, which goes through this in a lot more depth. And the fourth thing is to, based on an understanding of the context around the issue, identify one or two entry points for the message. And what I mean by that is that the best policy briefs that I've seen kind of go a little bit further. They don't just summarize a message and provide some good recommendations. They also point to entry points that might provide a means of change. So they'll talk about, upcoming conferences where that particular topic is going to be discussed, and how it should be put on the agenda, and who should push the sorts of arguments that they're making. Similarly, other examples of entry points include upcoming elections, the development of manifestos for campaigns, growing social movements around a particular issue, critical events, wars and other big shake-ups in the world have been shown to be quite big results of policy change. So do kind of use that list. Again, it's not a definitive list, as a way of the sorts of entry points that you could provide in your policy brief as a way to push for change. New information and changing perceptions is another one. But again, I think that the most important thing is to ensure that you've got quite solid recommendations. If you can't go the extra step and provide entry points, that's fine. I'm just highlighting that some of the better briefing papers, the more sort of actionable and hard-hitting briefing papers, have been ones that have been able to do this as well. I'm going to make another reference to communications here, and talk about, again, very briefly, because we'll talk about communications strategies next week at the end of our blogging session. But again, just like going back to what I said before, researchers tend to be happy or comfortable writing in a particular way. It might not be that policy oriented, it might be quite jargon filled. Policy briefs are really no place for that sort of writing. It's not about sort of just presenting the entire findings of a long piece of research with huge amounts of dense data, and just sort of throwing it on a page and hoping for the best. It really is about sort of pulling apart what you've found and drawing out the key key arguments and the key implications of those arguments. And that's not to say, for there are some organizations that have joined us today that don't have the benefit of a 5-person, 10-person communication team like Brookings or other organizations like that. You don't. I mean, it's nice to have that, but it's not a must. What is a must is to get your researchers thinking about putting a focus on communication, on thinking about the person that they're targeting, and getting them to answer the question, why are they reading this? What do you want them to do with this? That can help a lot. And I've mentioned very briefly what I meant by communication focus, but just to summarize, this is what I mean. It's understanding who you're targeting, what their needs and perceptions are. Oftentimes, decision makers don't have that. They have to get through a lot of information, so you have to understand their needs for shorter, bite-sized, more concise and clear products. You need to think through the refining and defining your messages. You need to think through writing clearly, as I said last session, stripping out redundant words, redundant sentences, even redundant paragraphs that really don't feed into your main point, and about telling stories, about trying to bring your evidence to life by kind of putting it into an everyday context. Just by way of an example of that, when I worked for the Overseas Development Institute many years ago, we were doing a lot of work on the use of cash in emergencies. So instead of providing food aid to people, pushing the agenda that we should look more at providing people with cash so that they can choose what they buy and when they buy it, rather than bombarding them with sort of food and different items that might not be particularly appropriate, etc. So this was based on a lot of research. There was a very large report, but what we did was we turned that into a policy brief. We obviously disseminated that to our mailing list. We held a series of events, including ones that we did in sort of key NGO and UN hubs around the world. So we did one in Nairobi, in Bangkok. We ran events in Washington and New York. We also developed a resource hub, which was basically an area where organizations who had used cash in humanitarian programming could sort of post their case studies and their lessons learned. So that was sort of what I mean about a communications focus. We produced things in different sort of ways that met the needs of different people. So the policymaker may use and pick up the policy brief, but the practitioner might look at the brief and then go and have a look at that resource hub that had a lot of examples of how other NGOs had used cash responses in emergencies over the conventional sort of food aid. I'd like to give my voice a little rest and ask you what you find to be the biggest set of challenges that you find when developing a policy brief in your organization. And it'd be great to hear from either, from some communicators or communications people, as well as people who are doing the research. And I've just flipped back seen a couple of questions. So let me have a read through those. But if anybody wants to speak up and just give one or two sets of challenges that you may have found when developing a policy brief. If anybody's willing to share that either over your microphone or on the group chat, that would be great. Okay, so there's not many people that are speaking up, which is fair enough. I've put you on the spot. I would quite like to just address some of these chat questions. So I've got Andres, who has asked, where I work, we write objective policy briefs. The policies coming from bigger investigations, but right now my organization is promoting the creation of a antitrust law, so I think an advocacy is better. Okay, so some people are developing more advocacy focused briefs rather than objective briefs. The question on sort of separating practitioners and civil society, I guess that comes from my experience, mainly working sort of on the aid and humanitarian side, that some organizations are sort of frontline delivery organizations. So you may have NGOs that are actually doing delivery of services and providing, perhaps food aid or medical assistance, whereas civil society may, fit into that NGO. NGOs might fit into the civil society broader group, but civil society can be more general and may not be providing services themselves and just be kind of commenting or writing about particular policy issues. So yeah, I mean, I think NGOs can fit into the civil society broader category. I wasn't trying to be controversial there. It was just, I was thinking about practitioners more as sort of possibly as service delivery type organizations. I've got a question from Pauline. Carolina, isn't it logical to set the scenario and then have the recommendations at the end? Or does one have the recommendations front and center and back them up as you write? Okay, great question, thank you. And Andres has the same question. What I mean with regards to having your recommendations as the first thing you do isn't necessarily that you write them down, or although I will advocate that you should have your recommendations, if possible, in a sort of summary box at the beginning, but it's that you should develop them first. So you should have you should write out your overarching goal of your policy brief, and then you should think through what your recommendations are, so that as you're writing and setting the scene and writing your introduction and your middle and your conclusion, everything that you end up recommending is addressed through that. So I'm not saying that you should, and we'll go into what the actual structure of a policy brief looks like in practice, but what I mean is in the writing process, you should begin with a piece of paper that says, this is my overall goal of this policy brief. I'm going to identify a gap somewhere. Something isn't quite happening that should be happening. This is what my goal is. My recommendations are that we should do X, Y, and Z. You may not set them out right away, but you need to have them written down, stuck on your desk somewhere, so that as you're developing your logical line of argument, you're thinking about both your overarching goal and the recommendations that you're going to be making at the end. I'm advocating that you don't sort of think about your recommendations at the very end, because oftentimes that messes up the structure of your policy brief, and you don't. I've seen quite a few policy briefs where I'm taken through a journey of trying to get an idea of what the writer is trying to tell me, and then there's a set of 5 recommendations that aren't necessarily addressed very well in the text of the policy brief. The jump is a bit too big there. I've got a final question here. Challenge: how to link the existing objective data with desired policies. It requires having a theory of change in mind. How do we know that the recommended actions will have the expected and not reverse results? Yes, definitely. I mean, that's often the case. I've seen that done a fair bit when you're writing policy briefs that outline an implementation process as well. But what I would say is that don't think that your recommended actions are going to be immediately implemented. They're really just going to feed into the general debate on that policy issue. Definitely, obviously, don't be advocating things that you haven't thought through in terms of unintended consequences, but your recommendation and the way that they're implemented in practice, and when that happens and how that is done is a very, there's a very big set of things that are happening in the middle. So I would say that be as bolshy as you feel that you can be in terms of advocating for something. Oftentimes you'll have an opportunity to talk about what to shape further what the policy looks like in practice as that gets on the agenda and is discussed a bit more in a bit more depth. One final question I've got: in my country, policymakers and the civil society in general do not read, even if it is a short text. So my organization and others in Guatemala need to have attractive policies, more images and colors. Okay. Yes. Well, we're going to come to sort of design techniques and synthesizing different things a little bit later. So I won't dwell on that too much, if you don't mind. Okay. So one of the big challenges that I often have to sort of, I guess, mediate between when I'm helping to develop a policy brief, since a lot of people haven't chimed in with their own, is that you've got a couple of things. Number one, researchers don't like to write policy briefs until their research is completely finished. Whereas I would advocate that in situations where you have, 2 to 3 year long research processes, you should perhaps produce an interim policy brief that has some implications or gives people a flavor of what you're researching. Number one, because that gives other think tanks an idea about what researchers are doing. It also makes policymakers aware that sort of topic and discussions are being studied and researched. It might also increase the funding that you are able to get for that piece of research. So that's one of the challenges that I get, that researchers aren't keen on producing a policy brief until they feel that the research is finished and they have a definitive thing to say. Whereas I would argue that there are always, even if they're not recommendations, there are often implications that come from the first year or first 18 months of a research project. The other challenge that I've also come across, and I won't dwell on this too much because I was hoping that you guys would kind of bring up a couple of challenges rather than me setting them out, but these are the things that I find, is that researchers complain that policy briefs dumb down their research. Now, again, this goes back to what I said earlier in webinar 1, which was that actually making your research understandable to to layman people, to make it, putting it in layman terms and making it understandable to your average person that isn't a subject specialist, is actually harder, and it's not dumbing down. It actually involves working harder on making that more accessible. And if you do want to have an impact, then what I suggest to researchers is that you do have to take that communication focus and not get so worked up about the idea that you're dumbing down. You're not dumbing down. You're just you're presenting your research in a way that is accessible to somebody that hasn't been in that process for the last 4 years. So I've got I've got an immediate comment on that, which is try working with academic researchers. I know that it's difficult to believe, but if you look back, and I know I mention ODI a lot, but that's because I spent 7 years working with them and largely going through the process of getting them to communicate better, because that was around the time that they started investing a little bit more in communications staff and communications product. If you look back at the sorts of products that ODI was producing 10, 15 years ago, they're quite similar to what the Rift Valley Institute were producing. And I'm answering Pauline, and I'm talking specifically about her organization, which is very academically driven. It isn't impossible, and I think but it obviously does involve a lot of effort and commitment to change the way that you're working and to make it more accessible. If what you're trying to do is shape policy and practice, which is, I think, one of your goals within the Rift Valley Institute. So it isn't. I know it's difficult, but it isn't impossible. And there have been many organisations that have made that transition. Right. I'm going to move on. I'd like to spend the last 10 minutes talking about the different structures. I mean, the structure of a policy brief and what they look like. So if we could kill my video so that I don't distract people. Right, this is what your policy brief should look like in terms of the weights of different sections. You want to have a sort of 10% of your brief should be an executive statement or executive summary that can be in a box at the beginning, so it pops out a bit. 10%, 10 to 15% of the brief on your introduction, setting the stage, maybe introducing what other people are saying about that particular policy, what other people are advocating. A tiny amount, I would actually lower this percentage amount, should be spent on your methodology. Don't write a 4-page brief that has 2 pages of methodology. Your researchers will very much want to put a lot more methodology into the policy brief, but you need to work on cutting that down. Even though they will feel that they need to explain how they came to those findings, the truth of the matter is that policy makers, they don't really care. They don't care that you interviewed X many people over X many months, that you ran statistical, how you did your sampling, how you accounted for bias. They don't really care. Researchers really care about this, and they should, and that's what makes the stuff that think tanks and research institutes produce so great, that researchers do care about that. But the person that's reading your 4-page brief does not want to read more than a couple of sentences at most about how you've come up with your conclusions. If they want to, they will no doubt be able to find that in longer reports or by sort of contacting you, but don't overdo the methodology. They don't care. Next section is your results and conclusions. This sort of sets out, basically sets out the answer to your overarching question or issue that you're addressing. What's the upshot, basically? And then another 30% on implications or recommendations. Oftentimes the results and conclusion section is merged with your recommendations. That's fine, as long as you make sure that your recommendations are pulled out and clear and are presented in sort of a bulleted list, that they're not buried in amongst your conclusion and results section. And finally, 10%, not more, on references or other useful information, for example, perhaps pointing them to the longer report. Okay, so just a reminder, policy briefs need to be, the nicest briefs that I read are about 4 pages, maximum 8 pages. You've got the sort of total number of words there as a guide for the 2, 4, maximum 8 page length. So I'm just going to take you through now what each of those sections that I've described looks like and what it includes. I've got some examples here that you can spend a bit more time going through in your own time. I'm not going to read through all the sample snippets that I've taken out. So your executive summary, as you'll all be aware, is designed to give an overview of the content. It should include all the standard items of your policy brief. So it should include all of this stuff in a couple of sentences. You shouldn't simply say, this policy brief summarizes the findings of a larger report commissioned by X, Y, and Z. That's lazy. You can obviously refer to the report, but you really want to summarize that within the executive summary. So make sure that you're giving the substance of what's in that longer report and not making them refer back to the larger report or read further down into your policy brief to find out what that is. So don't just say it's summarizing a larger report, summarize it for them. Remember that a policy brief should be standalone, so you shouldn't need to look at anything else other than that policy brief to get the main gist of the argument. There are different ways to approach the executive statement. Again, as I said, I've mentioned ODI a fair bit, but other of the hard-hitting sort of think tanks that produce a lot of these types of briefs will summarize their executive summary with 3 bullet points, with 3 key messages. They're not necessarily recommendations, they're just the messages coming out of the brief. So they might have a bit of introductory text and then 3 key messages. Some will have, will then go on to have a little summary of the recommendations front and center, which is a good way of doing it. And then obviously having a longer set of recommendations at the back. You usually write this one last. And some of the good summaries I've seen tend to try and hook their reader by including a problem description. So here's the problem, here's what we've done to solve it, or to reconceptualize it, or to provide some more information around it. It's obviously the first thing that appears, and it's on the very first page or the very first section of the very first page. It's really important to spend time writing this well and clearly, and to get other people to read versions of it to make sure that it makes sense, that it's punchy, because it really is what's going to define whether your reader goes ahead and reads the rest of it. So get other people to read it, get your mum to read it. Does it, I always advise researchers to really use the mum test as it's quite an important way to check whether they've sufficiently simplified what they're saying to be able to reach a generalist person who hasn't had their head in that research for the last couple of years. If your mum can understand the gist, that's kind of what you're going for in this summary statement. Here's an example. It's actually an example of an executive summary from more of a advocacy type brief. It's from a university. To give a bit of variation, I know that I've talked a lot about think tanks, but we have got people joining us from sort of more academic institutions. So there's an example. If you're keen for more executive summary examples, I'll happily post. So just ask for what you need using the Moodle forum. The thing that I like about this is that it conveys the urgency of the issue and gives a succinct overview of what you're going to expect in the paper. Our next section, sorry, that's an executive summary. Our next section is the introduction. Here's an example of an introduction. It's actually taken from the same brief that I used to introduce the idea of the objective versus the advocacy brief. This is the ODI brief on rising food prices. The methodology, as I said, does not need to be very long in a policy brief. It is, of course, as with every piece of research that is produced in a report, in a journal, in a policy brief, it is designed to strengthen the credibility of what you're explaining, of what you're recommending. But what I usually would advise is that you stick to highlighting, you don't talk about the number of people that you interviewed over how many periods and how many researchers were involved, and that you try to achieve gender equality in who you interviewed. That's not what you need. What you need is a very brief reference to sort of how you gathered research, and what you highlight is any unique methods of data collection. You may, if you desperately need to highlight a description of the issues and context of the investigation, if it relates or adds substantively to your point, and what methods you might have used. But again, really, this shouldn't be more than a few sentences. If you read, it's basically do the opposite of how academic journals are laid out, where you basically go through this torturous journey of what the researcher did, how they gathered information, the kind of analysis that they applied to that. Just do the opposite. That's what you're looking to do with policy briefs. As I said here, this section is not always applicable. A lot of briefs are completely stripping this out and perhaps putting a small disclaimer box or a little box at the end saying, this piece of research was drawn together over over period X by team of researchers Y. So it's not always appropriate, but here's an example of one that was used by the humanitarian policy group that I worked for many years. It adds to the brief's credibility because of what was done, that basically attacks on aid workers and the data from that over a 12-year period was looked at, and it had never been done before. And so this is an example of what your sort of methodology, of a methodology snippet that would add to your policy brief rather than take away from it. Your results and conclusions section. Again, it's designed as an overview of the findings. It's constructed around your lines of argument, and is obviously makes reference to your policy recommendations. In your results and conclusions section, it's good to move between general and specific information, and obviously base your conclusions on the evidence, data, or findings that you've gathered. So make sure that you're taking your reader on a journey and that they kind of understand how you've got there. And obviously make your assertions clear, balanced, and defensible. I will add a results and conclusions snippet or example to this presentation. It's not gone into this set of slides, my apologies. Right. Not many slides left. I would like to talk about recommendations and implications a little bit, because they're the things that people tend to have quite a lot of trouble with. I kind of use implications and recommendations interchangeably. I don't think that we need to spend much time on this particular slide because I want to go through how to develop good recommendations. Basically, implications are softer versions of recommendations. They point to the actions that could happen as a result of the research, whereas recommendations sort of talk about the actions that should happen. But I don't think we need to get bogged down on this. Here's an example of a recommendation that started its life as a very punchy, in its first iteration, promote healthier, apologies, there's a typo there, healthier nutrition in schools. What I always say is that the more specific you can be with recommendations, the better. You may have a policymaker that follows through your line of thinking and agrees with everything you're saying, because it might be a policy brief about rising obesity in school, in young people, and you set out a beautiful argument, and then you end with a recommendation that says this: promote healthier nutrition in schools. Okay, but how? A second version of the recommendation might be by focusing on school lunches, but a more usable recommendation might be to outline exactly what you want them to do. So provide healthier food choices in school lunches by moving fresh vegetables and lower fat foods closer to the front of the lunch line and removing soda from vending machines. Oftentimes, good recommendations are ones that include the word buy in them, because you're telling them what the implication or recommendation is, and you're explaining how they might put that into place. Some policy briefs, it is not appropriate to do that. It might be that, for example, you're advocating for more research to be done on a particular topic. You might not know how that's going to happen in practice, but this is just an example of a process that you might go through to sort of strengthen your recommendations a little bit more. So when you're developing your recommendation, keep in mind whether it's appropriate to kind of go a bit further by outlining how your recommendation might be put into place. It usually has a specific set of actions behind the recommendation. If you have trouble coming up with recommendations, I highly recommend having a look at Duncan Green's blog on recommendations that he developed. It's always a good idea to think about recommendations in terms of these key concepts. First is governance. Most issues across the whole spectrum of public policy that we work in will require improved governance, better coordination, more transparency and accountability, better integration of issue X into something else. So think about governance. Do your recommendations have a sort of a governance dimension that should be raised? Secondly, voice. Who is not at the table? Oftentimes, quite important to think about whose voice needs to be amplified a bit further. Third, economic incentives. There's always an economics angle to most policy issues. So you might want to advocate for getting rid of bad ones, for example, fossil fuel subsidies, or introducing good ones like clean fuel technology grants. So think about the economics of your issue and whether there are things that that could be done there and incentives that could be put in place to sort of push the issue. Social behavioural aspects. This is more for sort of NGOs. This is, as I said, developed by Duncan Green in Oxfam. So he's got a particular focus. But are there things like behavioural aspects that need to be tackled? So do we want to encourage better breastfeeding practices? Is there an element of sort of societal change that we want to be tackling as part of the recommendations? Consider technology. There's always a technological aspect in the same way as there's usually always a economics aspect, and you may want to think about how technology can have an impact on the particular area that you're discussing. It certainly has a big impact on health, on education. So it's something to consider when you're thinking through what the implications and the recommendations are of your research. This is a big one that comes up a lot. Is more and better data needed to tackle the issue? Do we need a bigger set of information? Does the data need to be more rigorous? Does it need to be age disaggregated? Are there issues around quality of data? And this is obviously a big issue when it comes to health. And the one that all researchers should probably end with is that it needs more research. After all, we don't want to be, out of a job. Some very quick things to consider, and I'm not going to spend a long time on this slide because I have again gone over a bit, and I apologise, is that just putting your recommendations out for consideration doesn't mean that that they're going to be acted upon. Policymakers are usually gauging whether to put a policy on agenda or to push it much further up the agenda. They're sort of balancing things like legitimacy, feasibility, and support of a policy. So certainly, put your policy recommendations out there, but don't assume that they're just going to be taken up unchanged or uncontested, or even if that they're going to get on the agenda at all. It's important to kind of be aware of these dynamics, so that you don't become disheartened that your big research project hasn't had an immediate impact. Research is only one element that shapes what's going on in policy. But do keep in mind those three areas that policymakers are sort of weighing up when crafting them, because the more legitimate and feasible you can make your recommendations, the more likely they'll be, the more likely they will be to have a bit more support. The final area of your policy briefs is the references and useful resources. This is great, especially when you're synthesizing information from multiple sources. Obviously, always cite appropriately, but don't include pages and pages of recommendations, if possible. Of references. If possible, point people to the larger report and to a sort of condensed list of references. I've seen in certain cases, a policy brief that was a nice punchy 4-page brief, but that's ended with 3 pages of references. That doesn't quite work. So just strike the right balance when you're including references. Right, I'm going to ask you to go through this last section of the webinar on your own. It's basically slides 45 to 60. The reason why is that we're going to have a discussion about these design techniques at the very beginning of webinar 3. These are, and a lot of these slides aren't sort of filled with text, they're just examples of common techniques used to help highlight your key message or key information by making it sort of visually engaging. As we can see here, design can help highlight key factors or concepts within your work, and can also, a well-designed, well-laid out policy brief can convey authority and credibility, and add sort of weight to your piece. One statistic I like to end with and get people to think about is that, as a general rule, policymakers often only spend between half an hour and an hour reading information on an issue when they have to provide. I mean, this isn't, when they're making a big policy decision, but often when they're trying to pull together a brief for a minister, or write a set of talking points, or come up with a position that might be debated in Parliament, they're really only spending about an hour, not more, reading across the various sort of arguments that are being put forth on that particular topic. So design matters. Making sure that your key messages pop out, that your recommendations are highlighted well, that your executive summary is boxed and written in a punchy and an accessible way is very important. It's not just about making things look pretty. So here are some common techniques. I would encourage you to have a look at those slides. As I said, there's not a lot of descriptive stuff here. There's just lots of good examples of what what policy briefs, good policy briefs look like, what headings that are more appropriate and good look like, what key point boxes, as you can see here, might look like. And it's especially important when people are developing their publications policy to think through what the format of your brief is, not just what the key sections are, how many words they're going to have, but what is your institutional style going to look like in terms of what you ask people, but what you ask researchers or your communication staff to do. You know, is your policy brief going to be required to have a summary? Are you going to need a key points box, as the Institute of Strategic Study have done here? Are you going to be the kind of organisation that includes pictures in their policy briefs? Or are you a more sober organisation that believes that they wouldn't quite fit? It really is up to the kind of thing that, the kind of organisation that you are, and how you're wishing to convey your message. But I would definitely encourage you to, you know, think through how you're presenting your data, to make use of things like text boxes, especially in instances when you're defining key terms, or you're perhaps adding snippets of your case studies, etc. This is also, this particular slide is a good example of where you've got sort of a pull quote that's been used, although this one's rather long. There are other examples as you go through the rest of this presentation. So I don't want to dwell on these last 15 slides, because I'd like you to have a look at them, and I'm going to post a topic for discussion tomorrow, for you to tell me, number one, what kinds of design techniques you're using, and what you might think, what you think might be appropriate, what you might think might be appropriate design techniques to add to your policy briefs, if you were the one deciding. So I'm not going to run through all of these, but do look through each of those with a bit more time, as well as the examples. So I'm going to finish there. It's been a lot of information. There's also a lot of snippets of the different sections of the policy briefs that I would encourage you to look at. And indeed, if you have questions about, other examples of good executive summary boxes or recommendations, I'm happy to post examples of those if you'd like more. But I'd like to stop there and ask if there's any questions on the non-design elements of policy briefs, because we will have an opportunity to discuss more design-based stuff on the Moodle, and as well at the beginning of our webinar on blogs. So Andres, yes please, is that with regards more examples? Great, okay. So I will provide a longer and more comprehensive list of examples of each of the policy brief sections for you to look at and to use as models when you're doing your own writing. Great. And was there anything from the last webinar that people, if there was anything from the last webinar that I haven't yet posted, you will have seen that I've added a few resources already. Do let me know. That would be great. But for now, I don't want to keep you any longer. I know I have run on quite a bit. Let's have any questions that relate to the substantive or the structure of policy briefs, and anything to do with design and how to use design to highlight your key messages. We can discuss at the very beginning of our last webinar on blogs. Okay, I'm not seeing many questions come in, apart from the request from Andres for more examples. I do recommend that you go back through the slides and have a look at the examples that I've included, but I will include, 4 or 5 examples of each of the sections of a policy brief that I've found to be very good. Okay, I'm going to close the session then. A reminder that our next session is next Tuesday. It is on blogs, how to write one, the different how organizations are using blogs. I do encourage you, even if you're a more academic research organization, to log in, because even organizations like LSE and other universities are using blogging as a key plank of their dissemination techniques. It isn't just kind of a way of writing informally and writing about recipes that you might have come up with. This is very much being used as a way to reach policymakers and to get them to kind of to read through into your policy briefs and that kind of thing. So do join the blog session next week. It is applicable. Thanks very much for the lovely comments that are coming in. So I'll close there. I will post some examples either this evening or tomorrow. Do join me next Tuesday for the blogging session, where we will go through a little bit the design slides that I've flicked through very quickly, and where we will then go through how to write a blog and the kinds of blogs that think tanks are using to convey or to disseminate their evidence. Great, thank you very much.